Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Erin Nerstad, and I am the Executive Director of the Master of Technology Management graduate program at UC Santa Barbara. Today's event is sponsored by MTM, which is a one-year master's program that equips early to mid-career professionals with the knowledge and skills to be leaders in technology-driven environments. Our students learn from world-class faculty and apply the latest cutting-edge research to understand how technology drives innovation in the workplace. Today, you will get a glimpse into the latest research of one of our faculty members, Professor Paul Leonardi, who will illuminate the causes of and solutions for a feeling we're all too familiar with, digital exhaustion. After the talk concludes, we'll have some time for your questions. So please submit your questions for Professor Leonardi in the Q&A function throughout the talk, and we'll answer as many as we have time for. This event is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording after the webinar concludes. And now it's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Professor Paul Leonardi. Professor Leonardi is the Duca Family Professor and Department Chair of Technology Management at UC Santa Barbara. He is a leading expert in digital transformation and organizational change. His research focuses on how companies can better leverage new technologies and social networks to innovate and improve knowledge sharing. He has authored over 70 articles and 4 influential books, including The Digital Mindset, A Guide to Thriving in the Age of Data, AI, and Algorithms. In addition to his academic work, Professor Leonardi frequently consults with top firms like Google and Microsoft. Welcome, Professor Leonardi, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks so much, Erin. It's a pleasure to be with everybody on this webinar. And I'm excited to talk about this topic that I think we're all feeling in lots of different ways called digital exhaustion. And if you're not quite sure what digital exhaustion is, I'm sure you felt it before, right? That feeling when you're staring at your screen and you just can't do anything else. You click through a bunch of different menus and your eyes roll to the side of your head, and it's hard to get motivated to finish what you're starting. That experience is really common, and it's what a lot of people describe to me as characterizing their digital exhaustion. And digital exhaustion is something that I have been exploring in and out for the last 20 years. As Erin mentioned, I published a book recently called The Digital Mindset. And that book, along with my colleague Sadal Neely, was really focused on trying to help people and organizations figure out how do we take advantage of digital tools to create organizational change and to do great things. There's a dark side, though, to all of the new capabilities that our tools provide us, and that is that they draw us in increasingly into an environment in which there are so many different technologies available to us, so many different data sources, so many decisions to make, so many people reaching out to us, that it's often pulling us much, much more quickly and swiftly towards these feelings of exhaustion. So I've been working over the last year and a half or so to analyze data and work with people and people working in companies to try to figure out what are some of the major consequences of digital exhaustion and what are their causes and what might we be able to do to help overcome these feelings of digital exhaustion that we experience. We can't just give up and stop using our tools. A lot of sort of popular press articles recommend taking a digital detox and spending a week or a month, if you could somehow get away with it, away from our tools. That might feel nice in the moment, but then when we come back, we're increasingly overwhelmed by all of the things we missed when we're gone. So the much more tractable and proven strategy is that we need to be able to understand where our digital exhaustion comes from so we can deal with it. Now, if you've been experiencing these feelings of digital exhaustion, you're certainly not alone. As I mentioned, I've been tracking digital exhaustion for about 20 years now. And the chart that you see on the screen here comes from data, nearly 13,000 people from across 12 different countries. And I asked all of these people a simple question. How much do the technologies that you use in your daily life wear you out? And what you see if you look at this chart is that there's been an increasing and steady feeling of digital exhaustion that has been compounding over time. And this feeling predates smartphones. It predates COVID-19, right? Since at least the early 2000s, really the dawn of the internet boom, people have been experiencing their digital tools making them feel exhausted and wearing us out in different ways. But you'll notice on this chart that there are two major inflection points that I think are important. The first is right around 2010, and this is really when we see the explosion of social media. At this time, Facebook and YouTube, so for the first time, reached 500 million monthly active users. There were over 100 million people on smartphones. And so content was now available to us in a way that it never was before. And so you see that first major jump in sort of people's reported feelings of exhaustion. The second, not surprisingly, comes right around the time when COVID-19 started to proliferate and work from home restrictions started to come into play. And our experience of having to be on our tools constantly to deal with work, to deal with our home lives, really started to affect people in profound ways. But I think what's most important is that we don't see a drop after that 2020 timeframe. In fact, although we see some leveling, people's feelings of digital exhaustion have continued to remain quite high. So this is a very pervasive issue. I mean, even the Surgeon General of the United States has issued a call recently to say we need to examine how we're thinking about our technologies because they really are driving an epidemic of exhaustion. So my work has been trying to focus on where does this exhaustion come from? And again, it's not just simply a matter of having tools and being exposed to data, but there are a number of underlying conditions that are really driving our feelings of exhaustion. And if we want to try to stem them and conquer our feelings of digital exhaustion, we have to be doing much better at understanding where these drivers come from. So in my work, I've identified what I call the exhaustion triad, the three primary forces that work together to sap our energy, our excitement, and our enthusiasm as we're using our digital tools. And those three forces are how we pay attention, the way that we make inferences, and the kinds of emotion that are peaked as we're approaching trying to learn to use new tools when our new Gen AI tools come on the scene and we have some amount of feeling about are they going to replace our jobs? How do we learn to use them? The kinds of emotions that come from how we attend to information and content, how we make inferences, all work together to really drain us. And I want to give you just a couple examples of these drivers, what attention, inference, and emotion looks like. And let's start with attention. So here's a couple of numbers that I think are really important. The first is that the research shows that the average knowledge worker switches tools about 1,200 times a day, meaning that we're back and forth between our email and our web browser and our Zoom and our word processor and our Excel and our Gen AI tools. So we're constantly moving back and forth many, many, many times. The important thing to know about that is that just moving across tools in and of itself is not a huge issue. But there are split-second reactions that cognitive scientists have identified that make it difficult for us to sustain attention as we're switching across these different modalities. So as we're moving across multiple tools, we experience a certain amount of cognitive fatigue as we're immediately needing to reorient to the different interfaces and the information presentation and the color and the displays and the functionality of all our different tools. Even though it appears relatively seamless, there's lots of good evidence that even these minor switches create cognitive fatigue. Now, as I mentioned, the 1,200 switches by themselves may not be perilous, but the bigger issue is that when we're working on a task, right? When let's say we're writing a report or we're running some calculations, we may be switching across a bunch of different tools in rapid succession in order to make that happen. The real problem, it turns out, comes when we're switching between activities that are very different in kind. So if we're moving from an activity, for example, like doing some kind of report writing to running some calculations, the mental shift that it takes to unlock from that particular aspect of work to then move to a different and get engaged in that new aspect takes its toll. Researchers at the University of California, Irvine have uncovered that it takes on average about 23 minutes and 15 seconds for us to get fully back to the level of attention that we were at before we switched across that domain, right? Before we switched across that context. That's an enormous amount of time, considering that we only spend about 10 and a half minutes or so engaged in any one activity throughout our day. So you can see very clearly how our shifts across multiple technologies and multiple domains of work begin to really tax our ability to pay attention, which creates a huge amount of cognitive load and stress for us. But it's not just about those actual switches. Even the sense of having to switch, or our perception that switching is imminent, can cause us a fair amount of cognitive fatigue and overload. In a study that I did recently, in combination with Asana and Amazon, we looked at about 12,000 different users, sort of different set than the ones that I've been charting for digital exhaustion. And we found was that people on average spend about 30 minutes deciding what tool they're going to use. That's a tremendous amount of time in a given day, not just to be switching, but to make decisions about what technologies and what digital tools we might switch to. And the evidence shows that those anticipated switches also have pretty profound consequences. A study out of Carnegie Mellon showed that when people know that they're going to have to switch and use a different digital technology in the very near future, they experience up to a 20% loss in performance just because they're expecting to be interrupted from their core activity and move on to another. So our ability to attend to a specific information and do particular kinds of work is limited when we are pulled and pushed in different directions and have to constantly move that attention across different technologies and different domains. And this is the first major source of our exhaustion. The second is what I call inference. We are exposed to data throughout the day that allow us to seemingly understand a very broad context in which we operate. And I say seemingly very purposefully. The data that are available to us through our intranets, the spreadsheets that we work with, social media feeds, Slack channels, you name it, provide us availability into actions that other people are undertaking. Perhaps behaviors that other people are conducting and opinions that other people profess. But though the availability and permanence of that data only ever reveal a partial truth, right? A partial set of activities of what's actually going on. But nevertheless, what we experience is that it's very easy for us to make inferences about what other people are doing, why they're doing it, what their motives are. It's easy for us to make inferences about ourselves when we see the trail of data that we leave for other people. And I'll explain more about that in a second. And it's easy for us to also make inferences about what other people think about us. And the research has shown for many, many years that inference making is one of the most cognitively and emotionally exhausting things that we do as humans. It takes a lot of work to piece together the information to make inferences, but also to deal with the emotional fallout of what those inferences tell us is a major source of exhaustion. Let me give you a sense of what I mean by partial data and how we make inferences about others, ourselves, and how others might view ourselves. And this comes from a great story that I heard from a guy named Dean. So Dean was a few years out of college, and his friends and he were planning a bicycle trip through Europe. And Dean was really excited about this trip. And at the last minute, looked at his finances and thought, hey, I'm trying to be a grown-up here. I just don't think I've got enough money to really take time off of work and pull off this bicycle trip. So at the last minute, he pulled out, and 3 of his friends went on the trip without him. They were gone for 2 weeks, and while his friends were, on this trip in Europe, Dean would log on to Instagram, and he would see posts of them biking through the south of France and through northern Italy, and he was really envious of the trip that they were taking. He saw them in front of, like really cool pubs and restaurants and having a drink with locals and playing bocce ball. And Dean was constantly looking at those available data and making an inference that his friends were having the time of their lives. At the same time, Dean spent a fair amount of time looking at his own Instagram posts, and he wasn't publishing a whole lot. He wasn't posting many pictures. And whenever Dean was looking at his own Instagram page, he really felt like kind of a loser, that he was missing out on this amazing trip and he didn't have a very active social life. Dean was also worried that people that were mutual friends of him and his friends on the bike ride were looking at his Instagram page and looking at his friends' fun trip and thinking, man, Dean really missed an opportunity there, didn't he? He must feel really left out. So you can see how, in this kind of trivial example that happens to all of us, it's very easy for us to make lots of inferences, not just about other people and the experiences they're having and their motives, but also we're constantly leaving data footprints about ourselves online that we use to make inferences of ourselves and that we believe others are using to make inferences about us. Now, I had a chance to talk to a number of Dean's friends that went on this trip, and they had some great stories, but they also recounted a whole lot of heartache and difficulties that they experienced. Um, when it rained and when they couldn't find their hotel and when somebody's wallet got stolen. There were lots of these kinds of issues that didn't get great photos taken of them and broadcast on Instagram. So it serves the point that really we're constantly engaged in this process of trying to discern from the available data what's happening around us. And that whole process of inference making that is so easy to do in this age of digital media and social technologies really is a primary source of our exhaustion. The last major driver of exhaustion that I mentioned is emotion. And in my data, I've identified 5 key emotions that people really experience as they're engaging with their digital tools on a daily basis. Fear, fear of not learning how to use a new tool effectively, fear of whether new technologies are going to create big changes in their work or their social lives that they'll have to adjust to, fear of missing out on important information or activities, much like Dean felt when the bicycle trip was happening. Anxiety, big feelings of not being able to make the right choice, the feelings that come with knowing that other people are doing things and I feel extremely left out. Guilt, that I'm not communicating as effectively with my friends and loved ones or responding in an adequate amount of time or with an adequate amount of care. Anger, associated with constantly feeling like I have to learn something new, and that I'm being hemmed in constantly by all of these new technologies. And there's also positive feelings of excitement, right? Excitement about what the future holds and new things that I can do more effectively, new capabilities that I have based on these tools. But there's so much research that shows that the experience of these emotions is also very exhausting to us, both mentally, physically, and emotionally. And I want to highlight just sort of one example of what a common feeling of anxiety that I experienced in my research sort of looks like. And you'll see right here, this was an evening that I was able to spend with a couple named Cynthia and Omar. And Cynthia and Omar are a married couple. They've been married for about 10 years. And, it's kind of their evening routine to sit down and pick a show to watch. And so they'll open up Netflix usually as their first choice, and they'll try to decide, well, what are we going to watch together? And if you look at this interaction that occurs from 8:30 in the evening to 9:25, it probably looks familiar to most of us, right? The whole idea is that we have so many options available to us, so many different tools, right? In this case, streaming platforms that we can look at and switch to, and data points about the movies, their ratings, whether people like them. So many options available to us that the amount of choice that we have is constantly leading us to feel more anxious, not only that we have difficulty making a decision, but that we'll make the wrong decision. And I can tell you so many examples that I experienced working with people like Cynthia and Omar, where the availability of options is a source of anxiety when we should think of it, right? And we hope that we would experience it as a source of benefit for us. But in fact, many of these feelings of anxiety that we experience are constantly draining us. Okay, so if we know that some of the major drivers of digital exhaustion come from the way that we are making inferences, how we're paying attention and switching our attention, and the kind of emotions that it peaks, what can we do to stop it? Well, throughout my research and practice, I've developed what I call 8 simple rules for digital well-being. And these are simple rules that apply in lots of different contexts and are sort of like a choose your own adventure, right? So the idea is that all of these rules are helpful in various ways at allowing us to overcome some of the problems that are created through that exhaustion triad. And we have to figure out in our own lives when and how we implement them. And those 8 rules, I think, are pretty simple. And just because they're simple, though, doesn't mean that they're easy to do. And the 8 rules are these. First, stop using half your tools. Research shows that if we can adopt a mindset of subtraction rather than addition and remove roughly 50% of all of the digital tools that are available to us, our exhaustion goes way down. Second, make a match. Make sure that we're choosing the right tools for the right job, and that has a significant bearing on our feelings of exhaustion. Third, we have to make smart decisions about whether we're batching, processing information in chunks, or streaming, dealing with things as they come in. And this applies both to just our daily communications with others, but to lots of other activities that we engage in. Rule number 4 is wait. We respond much too quickly in most cases to incoming queries and incoming communication. And that causes a whole lot of problems for us and for others. I'm certainly not advocating that we should, be a jerk and not respond if people need our help, but we need to be a little bit more mindful about the speed and the thoroughness of our communication. Rule number 5 is to stop trying to make so many assumptions about what's happening around us. Again, much as we discussed when we talked about inference, our ability to make those inferences and the assumptions that come with them is a huge source of exhaustion. Rule number 6, act with intention, that we do much better in controlling our ability to stop switching our attention so much, to deal with our emotions, and also to reduce the number of inferences that we make when we intentionally plan how we're going to be using our tools. Number 7, our technologies can be quite invigorating and give us energy. That happens primarily, I've learned, when we figure out ways to learn vicariously from others, when our ability to positively eavesdrop on other people's conversations and activities allows us to engage in new learning that improves our lives in important ways. And finally, be here, not elsewhere. Being engaged in some amount of flow while we're on our tools is really important to making sure that we feel engaged and we feel energized by the activities that we're using on our digital tools. I don't have time to go into all of these in a lot of depth. We only have a couple of minutes here, but I've got a new book that's going to be coming out next year called Digital Exhaustion with Riverhead Press. And I'll explore these issues in lots of depth in that book. And so you'll understand how these rules operate and why they work the way that they do. But I want to highlight just the first 3 for you here to give a sense of what could you take away today in terms of activities that will help to blunt your feelings of digital exhaustion. So the first is stop using half your tools. It sounds really simple, doesn't it? Right? Like I'll just make a list of all the technologies that I use and I'll eliminate a bunch of them. And that'll stop me from having to do so much attention switching. It'll stop inference making, right? Reduce kind of some of those negative emotions. But in fact, that's hard to do. And it's because we use so many different tools that have lots of interdependencies with other people. This is a list that a woman named Shireen, who's a product marketing manager, made for me of tools that she uses on a daily basis. And you can see 36 different digital technologies here. Some are more work-related, some are more home-related, that she uses very frequently and very regularly. So Shireen made this list, and we had to go through a number of steps in order to help her figure out how she could stop using a number of the tools on this list. And we went through 4 different steps. The first was to determine which tools we use at work and at home. Obviously, we have many fewer interdependencies with the tool use that we do at home. So it's easier to think about giving up some of those tools than it is to give up some different work tools. So step 1 is to really bifurcate your list, split it in 2, and think about which are the tools that are primarily work tools and which are home tools. The second is to identify what I call non-substitutability, meaning that this is the only tool that can do the job. There aren't others. Second, instrumentality. What are the tools I really need to do the work that I have? And third, network effects. What tools require me to interact with other people, and there's an expectation of me to be using these kinds of tools when I'm interacting with others. So we need to identify those tools because those are ones that make it really difficult to get rid of from our list. Step number 3 is focus on areas where we have influence to make a change. Um, we sometimes can dictate terms about whether or not we can use one tool or another. And finally, step 4 at the very end is to do what I call is conduct an energy audit, to think about what are the tools that maybe I've already crossed off the list that actually really energize me, that I enjoy using, that maybe met some of the criteria for elimination in the prior steps, but I actually just like them and they make me feel better for using them. So when Shireen did this list, you can see she was able to really eliminate, you can see the strike throughs here, about 50% of the tools on her list. The ones that are in bold were tools that she just used at work. The ones that were in italics are tools that she used at both work and home. And after trying to make some determinations about, where could she say to her client, for example, who likes to use Zoom, I prefer Microsoft Teams and that's what we use at my company, she could start to make some decisions about what she could get rid of and what she could keep. So we all have the power to eliminate a number of the tools in our stack. We just need to follow the right steps in order to make that happen. And when we do so, there are some profound implications in the reduction of our digital exhaustion. The second rule that I want to highlight quickly is the importance of making a match. And that is thinking about the objective of the work that we're doing and matching it with the capabilities of the technologies that we're using. Sounds so simple, but it's so hard to do, it turns out. So when we think about the various technologies that we use, and I'm just going to focus on communication tools here for a second, they're easy to array along a continuum of those that are very lean in their ability to transmit cues and contextual information. So email would be kind of the prototypical tool like that. And we can array them along this continuum to lean to very rich. And rich communication tools are ones that allow us to transmit many different kinds of cues to the people that we're interacting with. Not only can we transmit data, but we can transmit our sense of emotion, right place, the context in which we're working, and so on and so forth. Often what we experience is that we pick the wrong tool for the job at hand. And we often do it because there's a perceived easiness often with the communication or the interaction that we're having today, and we don't think about the consequences for the future. So for example, I was working with a colleague and we had an issue that we were struggling with, and we saw the issue very differently. And I thought it would be just easier to resolve that issue with the colleague if we emailed back and forth about it. But it turns out we didn't see the problem similarly. We both interpreted one activity that was happening from two different perspectives, and we didn't know that we were interpreting differently. What we should have done, because this was a tricky issue, was to use a medium that provided us more opportunities to engage in richer communication. Getting on a video call or engaging in face-to-face communication would have been much better because we could have realized earlier the nature of our disagreement. The fact that we chose to use email meant that there was a lot of miscommunication back and forth, and I started to make lots of attributions that the other person was being a jerk, that they weren't listening to me, that they were trying to be difficult, when in fact, we just had two really different interpretations about the situation. So my recommendations in how we think about making a match are twofold. The first guidepost that we need to look for is what I call matching for equivocality. When there's a topic, an idea, a piece of data that can be interpreted in lots of different ways, meaning that the data don't change, but one person can look at it and say, this is good. And the other person can look at that same data and say, this is bad. When we're in those kinds of situations, we're much better off using a much richer communication medium to help solve that problem. When the information that we're dealing with is not equivocal, meaning that it's very straightforward and we can interpret it very simply, those are great opportunities for us to use much leaner medium that are much faster and allow us to just move our communication forward without overwhelming us in a larger meeting that's going to take more time. The second guidepost is to think about what's the goal of our particular activity. Am I trying to convey information? Meaning, do I have something that I'm trying to pass along to somebody else? Or is my goal much more for our conversation around convergence, meaning that we need to come to some kind of agreement? One of the number one mistakes that I see working with teams and organizations is that they use a lean medium when they're trying to do convergence, and they use a rich medium when they're trying to do conveyance. Think of how many meetings you've been to where you're just talked at rather than asked your opinion. Those are meetings that could have been much better done via email, right? Or sent out to you with an agenda or some specific instructions. And often when we need convergence, we send the email instead of calling someone up or meeting with them in person. So when I talk about making a match, it's twofold. It's first thinking through what are those areas where I know I'm going to need to reduce the amount of ambiguity associated with this interaction. In which cases do I not need to? And second, what's my ultimate goal? Do I need to convey information, or am I looking for some kind of consensus and convergence? So make a match is rule number 2. Rule number 3 is what I call batching and streaming. So batching in the world of information processing is about doing things in blocks. So we process something as a big chunk, and then we move on to the next chunk. In the world of working, batching is really about pushing our activities into discrete blocks, and we work on one activity without interrupting ourselves to work on another. That's what batching looks like. Streaming, much like your streaming services, right, your Netflix, your Hulu, Apple TV, in which little bits of information are coming constantly and being processed by your TV and rendered into pictures and images. Streaming, we deal with data, we deal with issues as they arise. Okay, so if we get an email, for example, we respond to the email right away, even if we're working on something else. So batching and streaming represent two different ways of not just dealing with communication, but the various kinds of activities and work practices that we engage in on a daily basis. There's been lots of research about, should we batch information? Should we stream information? What works better and what works worse? And the research is pretty conclusive that for most people, batching is more effective in reducing exhaustion. And that batching works effectively if we tend to have lots of interruptions in our day, and those interruptions are constant. Batching works well if we have kinds of activities that we can group together, right? So if we're producing a report and that involves us running a little data analysis, writing some text, creating some images, all of those activities fall under the bigger guideline of doing this report, and we can batch those activities together. But the research also suggests that we shouldn't batch for too long, because if we spend too much time in an activity, we often then return to our email or we return to something else, and we realize that there's lots of fires that have been happening while we were intensely focused in this one area. So it does make sense for us to think about batching our activities, working on things that are similar together without interruption, but save those times for a limited window so that we can make sure we're looking to see how other things coming in. What the research also suggests, though, is that if there are situations that are anxiety producing, or if we ourselves are people that are much more anxious in general, streaming actually does a better job at helping reduce exhaustion in those circumstances. And it turns out that streaming is good for a couple of reasons, right? It allows us to immediately engage in tasks, clarify our communication with others, solve problems as they're happening, and solicit feedback and support for the things that we're working on. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, but what I've seen is the people that are most successful at effectively dealing with their digital exhaustion develop a strategy for how they're going to batch their activities and to what extent they're allowing themselves to be exposed to the stream of information and content that are coming at them. And that's a choice that you have to make given your own personal proclivities, the kind of work that you're engaged in. But What I have seen time and time again is that people that don't have a strategy for how they think about approaching their work in terms of batching and streaming experience much higher levels of exhaustion than those that do develop a much more explicit strategy. Okay, so we've covered just 3 rules, and we've only skimmed the surface of them. We've looked at eliminating half your tools, making a match, and batching and streaming. I want to just end really quickly, because I get this question so often, is what is our world going to look like now that Gen AI is proliferating and we're using different kinds of tools enabled with artificial intelligence? Well, there are some potential positive benefits that we could see. For example, AI tools that integrate lots of different capabilities will allow us to stay in one mode or one modality and reduce switching costs across lots of different applications. I see that as a very good thing. One of the potential downsides, though, is that there's a lot of rhetoric that's associated with any new digital tool that hypes these tools to a great extent. I think no technology in our lifetimes has been hyped quite as much as Gen AI. And that creates those experiences of emotion, both positive and negative, that really work to exhaust people. So it's important for you as a leader and just for us as individuals that we don't make too much hype about new tools like Gen AI, and we don't subscribe to too much hype, lest we'll have these feelings of exhaustion. And finally, it's important to be aware the ease by which we can generate content with these tools and provide more information, more data points that people have to deal with. The last thing we want is to be in a situation in which we are creating with so much ease data that are burdening the people that we're interacting with, creating more overload, more opportunities for them to have to process and feel worn out and exhausted. Okay, so we've covered a couple of things today. We've looked at what are the sources of our digital exhaustion, what are some simple rules that we might use to try to overcome that digital exhaustion. I hope you found this useful and interesting, and I encourage you to be well. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that illuminating talk, Professor Leonardi, and for all of those practical tips, which I look forward to implementing in my own personal and professional life.
Great.
So now we have time for some questions from the audience. So if you all want to go ahead and submit those through the Q&A function, we have just a couple of minutes to address some of those. I'll go ahead and kick us off with the first question for us today. So, Professor Leonardi, in the Master of Technology Management program, you teach a course on digital transformation, which was the subject of your last book, and which is about the perspectives and actions that leaders need to take to successfully implement digital technologies in their organizations. So I'm wondering, how does this webinar content now align with what you teach or how you teach in the classroom at UCSB?
Yeah, so it's wonderful to be able to talk about the class. You know, this is a class that I've developed over really 15 years or so, and it's exciting to teach because it changes every time I teach it, right? It's because all the digital tools that we're using are changing, the capabilities for organizations are shifting, and so I get to learn lots of new things, and I'm constantly doing research and consulting with companies in between the times that I get to teach the class. So a lot of the content that we explore in the digital transformation course is really about how do you make the right choices given an increasingly ambiguous and uncertain environment in which our organizations operate, right? We have now access to so many different kinds of data. Where do we decide what data we'll look at, what data we'll pay attention to? We have the ability to implement so many different kinds of tools. How do we decide for our workforce which are the ones that are most effective, and how do we generate buy-in for those tools amongst our workforce? How do we think about shifting our business model and our operating model so that we can take advantage of new information inputs that are coming at us and serve our customers in new ways? So in my course, we typically focus on those as strategic decisions that we can make throughout the course of our career, whether we're individual contributors or senior leaders in an organization. This content on digital exhaustion is sort of the mirror image of that, right? So for every choice that we make about a new technology that we're going to use in our organization, or a new way that we're going to become dependent upon AI for helping to automate a series of tasks, we have to consider what are the consequences of that on our employees, on us, in terms of having to learn new tools, be exposed to different kinds of data and information. And how do we develop a strategy as leaders around the information environment of our organization? One of the things that I talk about in the book that's also really important is that for almost every one of these rules, it's difficult to fully realize them without some kind of managerial assistance or help. Take Half Your Tools just as a very quick example, right? Um, I gave, I think, hopefully some good pieces of advice about how you could make decisions about where to cull tools from your technology stack. But the problem is, if leadership in your organization is really endorsing 3 different video conferencing platforms, you can't always opt out of them, right? And so it takes some bravery on the part of senior leaders to look across their portfolio of tools and say, we're cutting these out even though they're popular. And we're doing it because we have to reduce the digital exhaustion that our employees feel. So, long way of saying, I think it's really incumbent upon all leaders and organizations to be thinking both about what are the ways we take advantage of the capabilities of new tools, which has really been the focus of my class, but also how do we deal with those unintended consequences that using those tools provides? Both of those are super important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We have a question from Jayton. How can the technology companies design their platforms to minimize emotional exhaustion for users?
Yeah, it's a great question, uh, Jayden. So thank you very much. There's a couple of aspects. So the first is if we think about that exhaustion triad and you think about, attention, inference, and emotion, that these are interactive forces that are working together to create this sense of exhaustion that we have. One of the things that tool vendors can do, right, technology companies, is create more integrated tools that allow us to do multiple activities without constantly having to switch. And I know there are a number of project management companies project management tool companies that I've been working with lately that are starting to think in this way, that we want to provide multiple functionalities so that we reduce the potential switching costs that people have. This is also, I think, where AI agents can become really useful in that our ability to program those agents and give them specific task instructions will allow them to go out and be able to source different kinds of information and engage in sort of micro level activities that'll free us up from having to do those things in important ways. So I think that's on the technical side. On the more discursive side, right, the way we talk about these technologies, I think tech companies have been some of the biggest perpetrators of too much hype, right? And the news media also is, I think, somewhat guilty of making us feel like if we're not up on whatever the latest technology is, that we're falling behind and that our jobs are in jeopardy. We as leaders need to combat that. And I think what tech companies need to do is provide a more seamless and easy roadmap to help people figure out when are these tools useful for you, when are they not, rather than try to produce this rhetoric that if you're not using every single new tool, you're completely falling behind. Because that's a primary way that we get those feelings of, fear, anxiety, guilt that really are emotional drivers of exhaustion.
Yeah. Thank you. And actually, that takes us right up to time. So thank you so much again, Professor Leonardi,
Pleasure.
for a terrific talk. And thank you, audience, for joining us today. And if you are interested in learning more about the Master of Technology Management program, I encourage you all to visit our website at tmp.ucsb.edu, or you can reach out directly to me with any questions that you have. So thank you once again to you all, and I wish you a terrific afternoon. Thanks,
Bye, everybody.
everyone. Bye.